Okay, so now let's look at, exactly how large of an expansion of the federal government the New Deal was. So here we have, you can see this ramp up in expenditures. Essentially, this is the New Deal, and you can see the expenditures before were, rather muted. Um, and as you can see, this is as a percentage of the gross national product, which is the same thing as GDP essentially. And you kind of kicks off this big blip right here is World War II, and sort of kicks off the expansion of the federal government that has continued, throughout the 20th century. Now, there's a lot of debate around, okay, did the New Deal accomplish its goal of recovery? Like, if we go back to its goals, oops. If you go back to its goal, I would say definitely provides relief. And it definitely reforms. We saw the many ways it leads to reforms, both positive and negative. But there is substantial debate about the recovery. And I would say most economic historians would say no, the New Deal did not. Get back there. All right. That the New Deal did not lead to the economic recovery, that it's primarily the monetary policy that we covered last time. The U.S. leaving the gold standard likely was the underlying cause of the recovery. Okay, but it is the first large-scale expansion of the U.S. government. It's the first time the U.S. really provides a safety net, a social safety net, specifically in the form of Social Security and unemployment insurance. Like, those are two massive programs that provide a safety net for the elderly and the unemployed, which are two parts of the population, or two large segments of the population. In your life, if you're lucky, you'll get to be an elder person, and you may experience an unemployment spell. So this is something that most Americans will benefit from in some time in their life. Now, what's interesting is we have this massive expansion of the welfare state of providing these benefits. The U.S., though, still really lags behind the rest of the world, or the rest of the developed world, in the benefits that they provide. This data is a little old, but you can kind of see the public spending in the U.S. Is less than it is in many other similarly developed countries. However, once you add in subsidized spending, this is essentially tax breaks. And this is primarily health insurance tax breaks. So health insurance is something many Americans receive from their employer. It's a benefit that they are not taxed on. And from the employer side, it's a benefit that they provide that they are not paid. They are not taxed on either. So that health insurance is the lack of tax on health insurance is a subsidy. Once we add that in, the U.S. looks a little bit more like the rest of the world in terms of its social spending. Okay. All right. And so this just goes in depth on employer health care or health insurance. As it says, it's not private because it's excluded from taxable income. And this is like $200 billion the government could have if they taxed that. All right. And so in the US, we're typically, when you compare us to other countries, we're much more likely to tie benefits to work status, to whether you're working or not, than in other countries, where they tend to be more universal. And why this is a bit of a mystery. There's like kind of a history of rugged individualism that kind of you can think about traces to the Western expansion. Some good economic history work on that, on the mindset of the people that moved west. There's also this very key difference in whether that your income is determined by luck or effort. Okay. So in the U.S., we have we have much lower belief in the determinant of luck in your income than in other countries. So in other countries, say Portugal, Brazil, Denmark, Uruguay, Norway, Chile, they're much more likely to believe that luck determines income than the US. And you can see in general, there's this positive relationship that the more your country believes that luck determines income, the more it spends on social services. So that's, perhaps one clue as to why the US does not have the level of spending that other countries has. Okay, just to give a little bit more detail on what the government budget looks like. This often comes up when this when this class is taught live. So here we have the breakdown of the government budget. We have defense at 15%, Social Security, Medicare, which is healthcare essentially to the elderly, Medicaid, which is healthcare to low-income individuals, is 26%. Other safety net programs, interest on the debt. So the government owes a bunch of money they have to pay interest on. And then we could break it down to other things. This is the evolution of uh, two different large parts of the government spending: entitlements, which essentially include Social Security and Medicare. Those are the primary components of it. Entitlements, they call them entitlements because this is mandated spending. The government has to spend this. It's non-discretionary. Essentially, by law, they have to provide Medicare for certain individuals and Medicaid for other individuals, and they have to provide Social Security. So that entitlement spending essentially is going up. And again, I'm not making a comment on whether this is good and bad or good or bad, just showing what the data is. And then we have defense spending has been steadily declining. Essentially, it's the height of the Cold War here. Declines throughout the 70s. Reagan increases it here. Then it declines up to 2001, and then we have an expansion after 2001, and then it's kind of steadily been declining since then. Okay, so the Great Depression, really, so it changes our thinking about monetary policy, which I covered last lecture, but it also changes our thinking about fiscal policy in terms of the services the government should provide. We have this real expansion of the welfare state as a result of the Great Depression, particularly in the form of Social Security and unemployment benefits, and it's much more active in these arenas than it was previously. All right. Now, as I mentioned before, the general consensus is the monetary is more important in terms of ending the Great Depression. But you could argue that fiscal policy really has a much longer term or more significant effect. Essentially, the policy response is really, has this really long-term effect. It's still with us in the form of many programs today. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's forever changed the role of government in terms of what people believe the government should do. Essentially, most people would believe the government should provide some sort of social safety net. They think it actually has the ability to affect the economy. This is a Keynesian view that through government spending, the government could rejuvenate the economy that's gone into depression. And this we haven't touched on much, but they definitely regulate markets. Like the FDIC would be an example of that. But actually, there's much more direct market regulation that happens in the Great Depression. That does not have that lasting of a legacy. Most of that was a failure and is dismantled. But there is this ability. There's ability that the government should regulate certain markets, and that it kind of fits into an expanded role of government that comes out of the Great Depression. Okay, this is just from Pew Research. I've got the site got cut off here, but this is just kind of like general beliefs about what the government should provide. Education, different ones: education, medical care, health insurance, Social Security. This is it. That one: standard of living, housing, college education, internet. So you can see generally, where Americans fall. It's ranked in terms of things that the majority of Americans think the government should provide versus kind of less so. Down here, and we can see these differences, as you would expect, between lower income and upper income. Most upper and middle income individuals in the U.S. can provide these things, privately, whereas for many people, the lower income, they could not afford these things. And so this, perhaps leads to these differences in belief. But just kind of show you how expanded the role of government was. And fortunately, we don't have this data from the 1930s, but all these numbers would be lower. Okay. And if you talk to somebody, if you could find a really old person, my grandma would basically think that the government shouldn't provide any of these, maybe with the exception of education. And so this is kind of like, we're kind of at the end point, but it represents the changing beliefs about the role of government and how most people believe that the role of government should be greatly expanded than what it was in the early 20th century. And this is a direct legacy of the Great Depression. Just for fun, here are some other ways that the Great Depression really has long-term effects. So we can see it in stock portfolios. People who live through the Great Depression are much more risk averse. They're much less likely to hold risky assets than people who didn't live through it. This is work. This is work by me, not to toot my own horn. But what I found is that people who were married right at the beginning of the Great Depression, compared to those who were married right before it, had much longer marriages. They're much less likely to get divorced than people who were married right before the Great Depression. Essentially, if you're married during a downturn, you're probably well matched. If you're willing to get married, in the worst of times, you're probably going to make it. That's what I found statistically. I used a bunch of fancy statistical techniques to find evidence of love. Everyone. All right. There's lots of credible evidence that the Great Depression led to the baby boom. So the baby boom happens after World War II. We have this expansion of birth rates. And so there's work by Richard Easterlin, which suggests that this generation that grew up in the Great Depression had a low taste for material goods. They kind of grew up with not much stuff. And so when the economy was booming after World War II, they kind of spent their extra income on children, having extra children, rather than, they were buying lots of consumer goods, but rather than buying, spending all their money on consumer goods, they actually spent a lot on children. Prohibition, which happens in 1919, it ends in the Great Depression, but Prohibition combined with the Great Depression really takes out all of the US's nice restaurants. So many restaurants make most of their money on alcohol. So Prohibition took away restaurants' ability to sell alcohol, and then we're hit with a massive downturn in the Great Depression. So the US basically loses all its really nice restaurants in a span of about 15 years. And so this had a long-term legacy in that the U.S. culinary scene in the U.S. was much worse than it was in many other developed countries. Now, recently this has changed. I'd say the past 20 years, the U.S. food and restaurant scene has really come back. But for a long time, the U.S. restaurants were just not on par with their counterparts in other countries, and that's because all our good ones got wiped out because of Prohibition and the Great Depression. So these are some other just fun, lasting legacies. All right, that'll do it for the legacy of the Great Depression in terms of fiscal policy.